In the autumn of 1885, in a Colorado mining camp, Eric Mueller rebuilt the collapsed entrance of Number 6 Mine as his home. The tunnel had killed 3 men the year before. Locals said he was living in their grave. Working alone, dragging heavy timbers into the dark, he seemed to expect the mountain to repay a debt. What was he searching for in that tomb? And what happens when the mountain finally gives up its dead? His name was Eric Mueller, and the Number 6 Mine had been declared a dead man's pit. 3 miners, the Douglas brothers and their cousin Henry, had been crushed when the roof gave way a year earlier. The town of Silverton said the mine was cursed, but Eric saw something else, a structure already half-built by the mountain, a place where the Earth's own breath kept the temperature steady through the brutal Colorado winters. He moved into the entrance, shored up the collapsed timbers, and made the tunnel his front room. Locals said he was sleeping in a grave, but Eric wasn't chasing ghosts. He was chasing what the dead men had died trying to reach, an untouched coal vein deep inside, and he knew exactly where to look. Sultan Mountain loomed over the Animas River Valley like something that had never wanted men crawling into it. The Number 6 Mine cut straight into its eastern face, a dark square mouth shored up by heavy pine timbers that the Douglas brothers had driven into the rock 3 years earlier. Most of Silverton said those timbers had become a coffin. Eric Mueller looked at them and saw a house. He had arrived in the San Juan Mountains in the spring of 1885, a few months after the disaster that killed 3 men. Nobody knew much about him except that he had worked claims farther north near Rico and had spent time reading rock the way other men read letters. He stood quietly in front of the collapsed entrance for an entire afternoon, not touching anything, not speaking to the curious miners who passed on the trail below. He just stared at the sagging roof beam and the frozen pile of broken rock that sealed the tunnel. Old Caleb Hardesty, who had been underground longer than any man in the county, spat tobacco juice into the mud and said loud enough for Eric to hear, "That hole ain't finished eatin'." Eric didn't turn. The next morning he bought a pick, a shovel, and a heavy coil of rope from the supply store. He walked back up the slope and began digging out the entrance with no one to help him. The first thing the mountain gave him was silence. Not the silence of peace, but the heavy stillness of rock that hadn't been disturbed in a year. The deeper he cleared, the more the air stayed the same temperature, cool when the June sun baked the valley, warm through the first killing frosts of October. That was when Eric stopped talking about going back to town. Instead, he dragged a cast-iron stove into the tunnel mouth and built a dry-stacked stone chimney up the ventilation shaft. He hung a heavy canvas curtain across the entrance. He moved his bedroll inside and laid rough planks across the floor. The mine became a room. Townspeople started calling him the grave dweller. Some said he had gone mad from loneliness. Others whispered he was digging for the dead men's bones to sell their gold teeth. The truth was quieter and far stranger. Eric had worked as a surveyor's assistant for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad before the mines. He knew how to read the tilt of rock layers and how to spot a seam that bent toward daylight. And in the weeks he spent clearing Number 6, he found something the Douglas brothers had left behind, a rough charcoal sketch on a slab of sandstone tucked behind a fallen timber. It showed the tunnel running straight for 40 yards, then turning north into the heart of the mountain. A small X marked a point just beyond the turn. Beside the X, a single word, coal. Will Douglas had been 32 years old. His brother James was 29. Their cousin Henry had just turned 20 and had a new wife named Cora. On the morning of March 4th, 1884, the three of them had eaten breakfast together at the boarding house, then walked up to Number 6 with 2 mules and a wagon of steel rail ties. They never came out. A section of roof, the size of a barn door, gave way and buried them under 20 feet of shattered stone. It took a week to dig out the bodies. Eric learned all of this from the women left behind. There were 3 widows. Sarah Douglas, who had 2 young daughters, Mary Douglas, who was pregnant when her husband died, and Cora, Henry's wife, who had barely finished sewing her wedding dress before she wore black. They lived together now in a small whitewashed house on the edge of town, taking in laundry to survive. The mine company had given them nothing. The claim had been abandoned. So Eric went to see the widows. He sat at their kitchen table and placed the sandstone sketch in front of them. He didn't promise them riches. He didn't make speeches about justice. He simply told them he was going to find that coal vein, and when he did, every third bucket would be theirs. All three women watched him with hollow eyes that had already learned not to trust hope. Only Cora spoke. "Why would you sleep inside the place that killed them?" she asked. Eric looked down at the sketch. "Because the mountain already knows I'm here," he said, "and it won't let me forget what it owes." Work began in earnest as the first snow dusted the high peaks. Eric spent his days inside the tunnel, driving new timbers into the old shaft, replacing the shattered supports the collapse had broken. The rock around him groaned constantly, a deep grinding sound that traveled through the mountain like distant thunder. Every so often, a handful of dust would trickle from the ceiling, and his lantern flame would flicker without a draft. The mountain was settling. That was the dangerous truth. When the roof had killed 3 men, it hadn't finished shifting. The entire section of tunnel was still unstable, and every pound of rock Eric removed changed the balance. He had to learn to listen before every cut, to feel the vibration in the stone with his palm flat against the wall. Some days he would stand still for 10 minutes, breathing slowly, waiting for the mountain to tell him where the next crack was forming. Caleb Hardesty came up the slope one afternoon in early November, leaning on a walking stick worn smooth by years of mountain weather. He was the only man in Silverton who had spent time inside number 6 while it was still active. Eric watched him approach without speaking. The old miner stepped under the canvas curtain and ran his hand along one of the new support beams. For a long time he said nothing. Then he crouched and picked up a chip of black rock from the floor. "You're getting closer," he muttered. "The timber creaking's changed. It's not just weight now. Something's opening up deeper in." Eric nodded. He had heard it too, a different kind of sound, like the mountain breathing through a broken tooth. Caleb straightened with a wince. His gaze drifted toward the dark tunnel beyond the stove. "Will Douglas told me once he could smell coal back there. Said it was just beyond the turn, but the rock got too loose. Said they needed another week to shore it proper." The old man's voice dropped. "They never got that weak." Then he looked Eric hard in the face. "That mountain'll trade you gifts and grief in the same handful, son. It's already given you a roof. It might give you a fire. Question is, what's it gonna take in return?" Eric didn't answer. Because later that night, working alone by lantern light 20 yards past the old turn, he swung his pick into a jagged crack in the right wall and watched a slab of rock peel away. Behind it was not solid stone, but a dark, narrow cavity that the mountain had hidden for years. And from inside that darkness came a smell so sharp and rich it nearly burned his nose. Coal, ancient and deep, untouched by any miner. He held the lantern forward and saw the vein running thick and black, disappearing into the mountain. For one heartbeat, he understood that Will Douglas had been right. The coal was there, waiting. Then the lantern flickered. Not from oil, not from wind. From something else. Deep in the cavity, a sudden rush of stale air. And from far above him, so faint he almost mistook it for his own pulse, a low grinding rumble began to grow. The timber behind him creaked once, sharply, and a fine spray of rock dust drifted down from the ceiling of the tunnel. Eric stood perfectly still, listening to the mountain shift, and realized that the very act of finding what he was searching for might have just woken up the same force that had buried 3 men. He was not alone in the dark anymore. The rumbling stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Dust settled onto Eric's shoulders like a dry snowfall. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he eased the lantern forward again and let its light crawl across the black seam. The coal was thick, not a thin vein that would play out in a week, but a heavy band of anthracite cutting through the mountain's gut. He reached out and broke off a chunk with his bare hand. It crumbled into sharp, brilliant flakes that glittered in the flame. He had found exactly what the Douglas brothers died reaching for, and now the mountain knew he had found it. He backed out slowly, one hand on the tunnel wall, feeling the rock's temperature change with every step. The timbers that groaned earlier had fallen silent, but silence in a mine was more dangerous than noise. Noise meant the rock was settling. Silence meant it was holding its breath. By the time he reached the entrance, the canvas curtain was dusted with frost. Outside, the first snow of winter had begun falling over Sultan Mountain while he was underground, light and steady, the kind of snow that came before worse. Eric stood in the doorway of his strange home, watching the flakes disappear into the dark valley, and tried to calculate what came next. If he pulled coal now, he would need rail ties, a cart, at least 2 more men to haul. If he didn't pull coal, the winter would freeze his savings and the widows would spend another Christmas taking in wash to buy bread. The mountain didn't care about any of that. He slept poorly that night, the chunk of anthracite sitting on the table beside his bedroll like a black star. Every creak of the timbers woke him. Once, deep in the tunnel, he thought he heard something shift. He held still beneath his blankets, staring into the darkness toward the shaft, but nothing came. Only the mountain's slow digestion. In the morning, he walked down to Silverton with the coal wrapped in burlap. The main street was nearly empty, the cold having driven everyone inside except a few miners huddled around the stove at the general store. Eric found the widows at home. Sarah Douglas answered the door with flour on her hands and suspicion in her eyes. Behind her, little Clara and Alice sat on the floor sorting buttons. Mary, heavy with child, watched from a chair near the window. Cora stood by the stove, her young face already lined with a widow's exhaustion. Eric placed the burlap bundle on the kitchen table and unwrapped it. The coal looked even blacker against the whitewashed wood. Sarah put her fist to her mouth. Mary whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Only Cora stepped forward and touched the coal with her fingertips. Then she looked up at Eric. "How much?" she asked. "More than 3 men could ever burn," he said. "More than enough." Sarah's voice cracked when she finally spoke. "If the company finds out, they'll take it from you. They'll take everything." Eric nodded. He had thought the same thing during the long walk down. The mining company had abandoned Number 6 after the collapse, but abandonment was not the same as surrendering a claim. A good lawyer could argue the company still owned the mineral rights, especially now that the vein was proven rich. And the Colorado Coal and Iron Company had very good lawyers. The news spread faster than Eric expected. 2 days after he showed the widows the coal, a man named Reginald Templeton stepped off the stagecoach from Durango. He wore a long black coat and carried a leather satchel that bulged with papers. Within an hour of arriving, he had posted a notice on the door of the Silverton Assay office. The company was reclaiming all claims in the Sultan Mountain District pending a review of legal ownership. It was a blanket threat aimed at every small miner in the valley, but everyone knew whom it was really meant for. Templeton found Eric at the Number 6 entrance the next afternoon. He climbed the slope with surprising ease for a man of his age and stood just outside the canvas curtain, peering into the tunnel like a buyer inspecting livestock. "You've done impressive work, Mr. Mueller," he said, "but you're living on company land. The coal you've discovered belongs to the stockholders who invested in this mine, not to a squatter." Eric kept his hands wrapped around the handle of his pick. "The stockholders abandoned this mine the day it killed 3 men. They didn't pay for the funerals. They didn't pay the widows. They didn't spend one night wondering if the roof would fall again. I did." Templeton's smile didn't change. "I appreciate the sentiment, but sentiment doesn't change a deed. The company is willing to offer you a generous finder's fee and safe passage to another claim. Walk away now, and you'll have enough to start over. Stay, and we'll tie you up in court until the mountain freezes you out anyway." He left the satchel on a flat rock and walked back down the slope without looking back. Inside the satchel were legal documents thick enough to fill a winter's worth of reading. Eric shoved them into the stove unread and watched the fire eat the paper. The mountain groaned softly behind him, as if agreeing. The confrontation changed something in Silverton. The small miners who had been watching Eric with suspicion now watched him with solidarity. They had all suffered under the company's claims, lost ground to its lawyers, buried friends in its neglected shafts. One of them, a young Welshman named Reese Perry, showed up the next morning with a pick and a shovel and asked if Eric needed a second pair of hands. Then another came, a quiet Swedish giant named Ekstrom who could drive a timber faster than any man in the county. Slowly, Number 6 became not just Eric's home, but a communal defiance. But the mountain had no loyalty to any cause. On the morning of November 22nd, While Eric and Reese were shoring up the tunnel just past the turn, a section of the left wall buckled without warning. Rock the size of a plow horse crashed down directly where Reese had been standing seconds earlier. He had only moved because he turned to fetch a wedge. The dust cloud swallowed them both. When it cleared, the tunnel was half filled with debris, and the path to the coal vein was sealed again. They dug for 2 days to clear the fall. On the second afternoon, while hauling a split slab of sandstone aside, Eric's hands closed on something that wasn't rock. A small tin box, crushed nearly flat by the pressure of the collapse but still hinged. He pried it open with a knife. Inside were 3 folded letters wrapped in oilcloth and a single gold wedding band. The letters were written in Will Douglas's hand, dated the day before the fatal collapse. The first was addressed to Sarah. "We're close, closer than we've ever been. The coal is blacker and thicker than we dreamed, and by spring we'll be able to build you a house with real glass windows." The second was to Mary, saying he would be home for the birth and already had a name picked out if it was a boy. The third was a joint letter to all 3 widows, written with a trembling pen. "If something happens, tell them we didn't mean to leave you. Tell them we were trying to reach the fire." Eric sat in the dust of the tunnel, the letters spread across his knees, and realized that the Douglas brothers had known. The mountain had been talking to them too, groaning, settling, warning them. They had pushed deeper anyway, not out of recklessness, but because the coal vein was large enough to lift their families out of poverty forever. They had gambled everything, and the mountain had taken the bet. That night, Eric carried the tin box down to Silverton. He placed it on the widow's table again, but this time the table bore letters instead of coal. Sarah read her husband's words and collapsed into a chair. Mary held the gold band against her belly and sobbed without shame. Cora, the youngest, read the joint letter twice, then folded it carefully and looked at Eric with eyes that had seen too much for her age. "He was trying to reach the fire," she repeated. "Now you're standing in his last footprints. What makes you think the mountain will let you walk out when it didn't let him?" It was a question Eric couldn't answer. Because even as he stood in the widow's kitchen, a deep vibration was traveling through the rock of Sultan Mountain, building pressure along the same fault line that had already killed 3 men. The coal vein lay waiting beyond the fresh fall of rock, and the storm of winter was gathering strength over the Animas Valley. The mine had become more than a home. It had become the one place on Earth where 3 dead men's hopes were buried. And Eric had made a promise to their widows that he intended to keep, even if the mountain had other plans. The next afternoon, Templeton returned. This time he didn't come alone. 2 men wearing company canvas coats and carrying heavy walking sticks flanked him up the slope. They stopped just below the canvas curtain, where the wind had started to blow loose snow into spirals. Templeton's black coat was buttoned to his throat. His breath came in short white bursts. "The company has reviewed the original survey," he said, pulling a folded document from inside his coat. "The mineral rights to number 6 were never legally abandoned. The claim lapsed for non-payment only after the accident, but a Colorado judge in Durango has signed an order reinstating corporate ownership as of this morning." He held the paper out like a warrant. "You have until nightfall to vacate the premises and remove your personal effects. After that, the law considers you a trespasser and a thief. I trust you understand the difference." Eric did not touch the paper. He stepped aside and let Templeton look past him into the tunnel. The stove glowed faintly in the darkness. The timbers stood straight and solid. The place smelled of wood smoke and coal dust and something else, something ancient. 3 men died in this hole so your company could take a cheap shortcut on the shoring," Eric said. "You've never put a penny into making it safe." I've put my hands on every timber you see. I've listened to this mountain talk and I've learned when to listen harder. You can't take that with a piece of paper." Templeton's smile didn't waver. "The law disagrees." He tucked the document back into his coat. "I'll give you those hours, not because you deserve them, but because the widows you've convinced to believe in you will have an easier winter if you walk away with your skull intact. Don't make this harder for them." He turned and started down the slope. The 2 company men lingered, one of them looking at the tunnel's roof with the practiced eye of someone who had spent time underground. "She's talking," he muttered to the other, gesturing at the ceiling. You hear it, popping, that roof still waking up. They followed Templeton down without another word. Eric stood alone in the falling snow. Inside, the mountain creaked once, a low sound that traveled through the rock like something large turning over in its sleep. He knew the roof was still shifting. He had felt it all morning, but leaving was not an option. Not because of pride, because Cora's question had not left his mind since the night of the letters. What made him think the mountain would let him walk out when it hadn't let the others? The answer was not that he was smarter or stronger. The answer was that he had made a promise to 3 women who had already buried enough. And if the mountain meant to take him too, it would have to take him with a shovel in his hands. By evening, Silverton had heard the news. Templeton's court order had been posted at the assay office for all to read. A small crowd gathered in the street outside the general store, miners stamping their feet against the cold, voices tight with anger. The Welshman Rhys Perry climbed onto a crate and shouted that number 6 had been abandoned, that everyone knew it, that the company only wanted it back because someone else had found the coal. Ekstrom the Swede stood silently at the edge of the crowd, a heavy axe handle resting on his shoulder. Others carried picks or spoke in low, fast voices about what they would do if company men tried to take the claim. Caleb Hardesty pushed his way through the knot of men and silenced the talk with a single raised hand. His voice was rough as gravel. "You lot think you're helping Eric by standing out here waving tools. That's the exact help Templeton wants. A fight gives him cause to bring in the sheriff with rifles. Then Eric's not just a trespasser, he's a violent offender. They'll put him in the ground alongside the Douglases." The crowd went quiet. Rhys climbed down. Caleb looked up at the mountain, where the tunnel entrance was no longer visible in the dark. "Eric doesn't need us to fight his war. He needs us to keep him alive while the lawyers sort out the truth. And the truth is, I know something about this claim that Templeton doesn't. Something I've kept to myself for nearly 2 years." He paused, and the silence around him grew deeper. Will Douglas filed a discovery notice before he died, with the county clerk in Silverton. It listed the coal vein by compass bearing and depth and named all 3 men as equal partners in the claim. I was with him when he signed it. The document exists. It's been sitting in a dusty cabinet in the courthouse since the week before the collapse. The revelation struck the crowd like a spark into dry tinder. If the discovery notice was valid, the claim belonged to the Douglas brothers and Henry, not to the company. Their widows were the legal heirs. Eric was not a squatter. He was working a claim that the company had never owned. But there was a problem. 2 days before the collapse, Will Douglas had sent a telegram to the Colorado Coal and Iron Company office in Denver, reporting the discovery and asking for permission to file a formal mineral lease under the company's oversight. The company had not responded before the accident. Templeton could argue that the request to file a lease was an admission that the company owned the claim. It was exactly the kind of ambiguity that lawyers were paid to twist. Eric spent the night awake inside the tunnel, staring at the rock wall that separated him from the coal vein. The fall that had sealed the tunnel again was not total. A narrow gap remained near the ceiling, a slit no wider than a man's chest. Beyond it lay the black cavity where the anthracite ran deep. The coal was close enough to touch if he could only squeeze through, but the gap was dangerous. Any sound, any tremor could collapse it entirely, and the mountain had been trembling all week. Just before first light, he made his decision. He tied a coil of rope around his waist and fastened the other end to a timber post driven deep into the floor. He wedged a second lantern into a crack near the gap. Then he began to work, slowly and silently, pulling the loosest rocks from the pile one by one, stacking them behind him. Every breath felt borrowed. Every creak from the ceiling stopped his hands mid-motion. But inch by inch, the gap widened. Rhys arrived an hour after sunrise to find Eric wedged halfway through the opening, his shoulders scraped raw, one arm reaching into the darkness on the far side. "You're mad," Rhys whispered. "The whole mountain could come down on you." Eric's voice came back muffled and strained. "Then pull me out fast." It took another 30 minutes to clear enough space to crawl through. When Eric finally dropped onto the far side of the rockfall, he landed in the same dark chamber he had discovered weeks earlier. The coal still gleamed in the lantern light, black and oily and endless. But something was different now. The air was moving. A faint draft pushed past him from deeper in the cavity, carrying a smell he had not noticed before. Not coal, something sharper, colder, almost metallic. He held the lantern forward and followed the draft, stepping carefully over fallen slabs. The cavity widened into a small natural chamber roughly 20 feet across. At its far end, the rock wall was not solid. A deep fissure split the stone from floor to ceiling, a crack so deep the lantern light couldn't reach its end. And from that fissure came the steady push of cold air. Eric knelt and pressed his palm against the stone floor. It was dry and cool, but vibrating faintly. The same vibration he had felt for weeks, stronger now. The mountain was breathing through this crack. It was a ventilation shaft, natural and ancient, connecting the coal seam to some deeper void inside Sultan Mountain. The Douglas brothers had never found this. If they had, they might have known the roof was about to give. This crack was the mountain's warning and its gift. He backed out of the chamber, crawled through the narrow gap, and told Reese what he had seen. The draft comes from somewhere below. If we can follow it, we might find a second exit, or at least a safer way to pull the coal without stressing the roof. But Reese looked at him with a face drained of color. Or you might follow a crack straight down into a sealed chamber full of bad air. Coal mines aren't just rock and fire, they're gas pockets. One spark in the wrong place and this whole mountain burns. That was the truth Eric had not wanted to face. Anthracite was valuable, but it also gave off methane. The deeper you went, the more dangerous the air became. And a natural fissure like the one he had found could be feeding gas up from deeper seams, pooling invisibly in the cavity. The draft he felt was not just air. It might be a slow leak of something explosive. In that moment, Eric realized that the mountain had given him a house, a coal vein, and now a hidden airway. But it was also giving him a warning that no miner could ignore. The deeper he went, the more the mountain would demand, and the price might not just be his own life. If the gas ignited, it could blow out the entire mine entrance, burying anyone inside and sending a signal to Silverton that the number 6 curse had claimed another victim. Templeton chose that exact afternoon to file a second motion. It accused Eric of fraudulent occupation, claimed the widows had no legal standing, and demanded the sheriff execute the eviction immediately. The sheriff, a weary man named Grissom who had lost a brother in the mines years before, posted the notice at the base of the slope but refused to climb it. "I'll serve the paper when he's ready to hear it," Grissom told Templeton. "I won't drag a man out of a hole that might come down on all of us." That night, the temperature fell harder than any night yet that winter. The snow that had been falling softly turned sharp and wind-driven. By midnight, it was a full blizzard, screaming down the Animas Valley and piling drifts across the mine entrance. Eric and Reese had barely secured the canvas curtain before the storm hit. Inside the tunnel, the stove burned hot, and the deep cold outside only made the contrast sharper. While the blizzard roared over the mountain, the air inside settled into an eerie stillness. The rock itself insulated them. And then, in the darkest hour of the storm, the mountain spoke. Not a creak this time. Not a rumble, a deep hollow crack that sounded like a shot from a heavy rifle. The floor bucked once beneath Eric's boots, dust blasted from the ceiling. The lantern swung wildly on its hook. In the chaos, the rope Eric had tied to the timber post earlier went suddenly slack. He grabbed the coil and yanked. The rope came free. The timber post had snapped. From the far end of the tunnel beyond the rockfall came a new sound. A long, breathy rush of air, exactly like a giant exhaling. The fissure had widened. The natural airway was opening wider, and with it, the faint metallic smell grew stronger, filling the mine with the unmistakable warning of fire damp. Methane, the gas that had killed more miners than rockfalls ever had. Eric stood frozen, listening to the mountain breathe out its poison, and understood that Templeton's eviction order was no longer the most immediate threat. The true danger was the mountain itself, which had just decided to reveal all its secrets at once. And deep inside, past the crack, past the gas, the coal vein still waited, untouched and burning dark, like a promise the dead men had made that no one had yet kept. The metallic smell thickened until Eric could taste it on his tongue, a cold chemical bite that meant the air was turning lethal. Reese grabbed his arm and pulled him back toward the entrance, but Eric didn't move. He was staring at the lantern flame. It had begun to burn a strange faint blue at its tip, the color of fire damp meeting fire. One spark, one wrong step, and the whole tunnel would turn into a cannon barrel with them as the shot. "Wet cloth over your mouth," Eric said. "No metal on metal, no boots scraping, and put out every flame except that one lantern, slow and easy." They moved through the darkness with the care of men defusing a bomb. Outside, the blizzard screamed against the canvas curtain, but inside the mine was dead still, the methane pooling invisibly along the ceiling like a rising tide. Eric knew the gas was heavier than air only when cold, and this gas was warm enough to float upward, collecting in the highest pockets of the cavity. If they could relieve the pressure from above, the mountain might exhale the poison safely into the storm. He thought of the fissure. The draft was pushing air upward from somewhere deep, which meant the mountain had a natural chimney. If he could find where it emerged on the surface, he could clear a path for the gas to escape. But that meant climbing out into the blizzard, finding an invisible crack on a snow-covered mountain, and digging through frozen rock in the dark. There was no other choice. Eric tied a second rope to his waist and handed the free end to Reese. "If you feel 3 sharp tugs, pull me out with everything you've got." He wrapped his face in a wet wool scarf and pushed through the curtain into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The wind was so loud he couldn't hear his own breathing. Snow drove sideways, stinging his eyes, and the darkness was absolute except for the faint glow of the lantern behind him. He crawled upward on hands and knees, feeling the rock face for any sign of a blowhole, a patch where the snow was melting faster, a whistling sound, a puff of steam. For 10 minutes he found nothing but ice and sharp stone. Then his right hand plunged through crusted snow into empty air. A small opening, no wider than a bucket, exhaled warm breath into the freezing night. The gas was rising through this vent, invisible but steady. Eric began digging with his bare hands, pulling rocks aside, widening the hole until the warm air rushed out in a visible column that the blizzard's wind immediately shredded. He could smell the methane fatting, diluting into the storm. The mountain was breathing clean. He stayed there until the metallic taste vanished entirely. Then he crawled back down the slope, half frozen, and pushed through the curtain to find Reese standing with the lantern raised, a cautious smile on his face. "Flames back to yellow," Reese said. "Crisp and clean, you did it." Eric collapsed beside the stove, his fingers too numb to unbend, and allowed himself one single moment of relief. The mountain had given them a warning. This time they had listened fast enough. By dawn, the blizzard had spent its fury. The valley lay buried under fresh drifts, and the canvas curtain was half frozen shut, but inside number 6 the air remained steady. Eric and Reese crawled back through the narrow gap into the cold chamber. The fissure still breathed gently, but now the air was cool and odorless. The poison had bled off overnight. Eric held his lantern toward the black seam. It was time. They worked in careful shifts, driving wedges into the coal face and breaking off chunks that glittered like obsidian. Reese filled canvas sacks while Eric shored up the ceiling with fresh timbers. By midday, they had hauled out more than 300 pounds of anthracite, the richest coal any man in Silverton had seen in years. Ekstrom arrived with a mule and a sled, and the first load was wrapped in burlap and roped down tight for the journey to town. The widows saw the sled coming from the window. Sarah Douglas stepped onto the porch with her daughters behind her. Mary, heavy with child, braced herself against the doorframe. Cora stood at the front, her thin coat pulled tight, watching the mule struggle through the snow with a heavy load. When Eric pulled back the burlap and showed them the coal, Sarah began to cry. Not with joy, not yet. With the release of a hope she had refused to feel for nearly 2 years. "It's real," she whispered. "He found it." Cora walked to the sled and placed her hand flat against a lump of anthracite as if touching her husband's last thought made solid. Then she turned to Eric. "What about the company?" Templeton had not given up. Even as the coal sled stood in the widow's yard, he was at the courthouse in Silverton with a fresh stack of papers, demanding the sheriff enforce the eviction and seize the mineral output. Sheriff Grissom, a man who had buried too many miners to feel loyalty to a Denver corporation, listened in silence while Templeton argued. Then Grissom reached into his own desk and produced the discovery notice that Caleb Hardesty had sworn existed. The document was dusty and yellowed, but the signature was plain. William J. Douglas, James T. Douglas, Henry F. Douglas, equal partners, witnessed by Caleb B. Hardesty, filed on March 1st, 1884, 3 days before the roof fell. Grissom laid the paper on the table in front of Templeton. This claim was never the company's to lose. It belonged to 3 dead men and their families. The court order you brought from Durango is based on a false premise. I'm not executing anything until a proper judge reviews this evidence. Templeton's face went rigid. He turned without a word and walked out. The legal battle would drag on for months, but the core truth had shifted. Eric was not a squatter. The widows were not beggars. The number 6 mine was theirs. Eric stood in the widow's kitchen that evening and made the promise formal. I told you every third bucket would be yours. I meant every word. The mine yields to 3 families now, Sarah, Mary, and Cora, equal shares. I'll keep working the vein, but the coal belongs to you. He placed a small ledger on the table with 3 columns marked in pencil. Every pound we pull, every dollar it sells, gets divided fairly, until the mountain gives out or we're all too old to dig. Cora looked at the ledger, then at Eric, with an expression that carried more than gratitude. It carried the fierce dignity of someone who had been counted out and was suddenly seen. Will would have liked you, she said. He would have said you're the only man besides him stubborn enough to listen to a mountain. Over the following weeks, the number 6 settlement took shape. Eric continued to live in the mine entrance, but now it was more than a shelter. The constant temperature that had first drawn him, cool in summer, warm in winter, proved to be not a mystery but a gift of the deep fissure. The crack in the mountain's belly was part of an ancient geothermal circulation, drawing cool air from the valley floor and warming it against deeper stone before releasing it through the upper blowhole. The mine breathed like a living lung, and inside its stone walls the temperature never dropped below 50 degrees even when the outside air plunged to 20 below. Eric had not built a home against the mountain. The mountain had already built one millions of years before he arrived. He simply moved in and learned the rules. The coal kept coming. Every week, a new sled went down to Silverton. The widows stopped taking in laundry. Sarah bought real glass windows for her house, the ones Will had promised. Mary gave birth to a healthy son and named him William James Douglas, after the 2 brothers who would never hold him. Cora used her share to open a small school for miners' children, teaching them to read and to understand the mountain's warnings from a young age. The curse of number 6 became a legend of redemption, told in saloons and assay offices from Durango to Denver. Eric himself rarely came to town. He preferred the silence of the tunnel, the creak of settling rock, the smell of coal dust and wood smoke. At night he would sit by the stove and study the natural fissure that had become his ventilation system, marveling at how the mountain had concealed its deepest treasure for so long. The 3 dead men had nearly found it, had smelled it on the draft, had felt its promise vibrating through the floor. They had been so close that their final letters still carried the excitement of discovery. And now, because one stubborn man had refused to leave their grave, their families would never know hunger again. The final surprise came in early spring, when the snow had melted enough for proper surveying. Eric and Reese followed the fissure deeper into the mountain, past the coal seam, through a narrow passage that opened into a second chamber. There, glowing faintly in the lantern light, were veins of silver ore threading through the granite. The Douglas brothers had been mining coal, but the mountain held more. The fissure that had threatened to kill Eric with gas had actually been the mountain's way of revealing its full riches, a geological cross-section that exposed both fuel and precious metal, as if the earth itself had decided to settle the debt. Eric did not announce the silver. He told only the widows, and together they agreed to keep the discovery quiet until they could secure the claim against any further company challenges. But the knowledge changed everything. The number 6 mine was not just a coal mine anymore. It was a fortune. Years passed. The small tunnel entrance that Eric had shored up with timber and hope grew into a permanent structure with a proper door, a stone chimney, and a sign above the entrance that read simply, Number 6, Douglas Claim. Eric Mueller lived there for the rest of his life, tending the mountain's slow breath, sharing its gifts with the three families who had lost everything. Travelers through the San Juan Range would sometimes see the mine from the Valley Trail, a dark square in the mountainside with smoke rising straight into the sky, and they would tell each other the story of the grave dweller who became the mountain's keeper. They said the coal never ran out, and the silver stayed hidden, and the widow's children grew up strong and educated. They said the mountain that had taken 3 lives had spent the rest of its years giving back what it owed. And they said the man who rebuilt a tomb into a home had understood something most people never learned, that the dead do not want revenge. They want their promises kept. Eric Mueller never called what he did a miracle. He never called it bravery either. When people asked why he stayed inside a mine that had already killed 3 men, he would tap his finger against the wall and say the mountain had given him more than it ever took. It gave him shelter when the winter tried to kill him. It gave him a draft of cool air in summer and a pocket of warmth when the snow piled to the roof. It gave him coal, thick and black, and it gave him silver hidden for centuries. But the mountain didn't give him the thing that mattered most. He had to bring that himself. What he brought was a promise made not to the dead but to the women they left behind. A promise that those widows would not spend the rest of their lives invisible, forgotten, quietly erased by a company that had already written them off as a loss. Eric Mueller did not defeat the mountain. He didn't tame it. He simply agreed to live by its rules, to listen when it groaned, to back away when it trembled, and to trust that the same force that crushed 3 men might also be capable of mercy if someone paid attention long enough. The story of Number 6 Mine is not about one man's survival. It's about what becomes possible when someone decides that a debt is worth more than a fortune. The coal and the silver were gifts. The real wealth was proving that 3 dead miners had mattered, that their final letters were not just words lost in darkness, but a claim on the future, that their families deserved glass windows and warm stoves and children who learned to read. In the end, the mountain didn't keep the coal. Eric didn't keep the coal. It all went to the widows and their children and their children's children. So maybe the question isn't whether Eric Mueller was brilliant or foolish, stubborn or blessed. The deeper question is this: how many promises do we walk past every day, buried like coal in the dark, waiting for someone to remember they exist? How many debts do we owe to people who died trying, who got so close they could smell the fire but never felt the warmth? Eric Mueller moved into a grave and turned it into a home. In doing so, he proved that some holes in the earth are not just wounds. They are invitations, and the people we lose don't always ask for grief. Sometimes they just want someone to finish what they started. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the debts that outlive us and the promises we keep to the dead, then hit subscribe and join us for more stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when nobody expected them to. Until next time, keep listening. The mountain might be talking.